In this video, I'd like to share with you a fun creativity boosting exercise that you can do with ink wash. Of course, you'll need a bit of ink. I'll be using Liquitex ink, and I always like to look for carbon black on the label. Carbon black inks seem to be a bit richer and darker in tone. We're just going to need a couple of drops of the ink, so I'll place a couple drops on the palette. Now, we'll be working on watercolor paper for this. I'll be using 140 pound cold press watercolor paper by Strathmore, and I'm going to start with a Hake brush and just apply a liberal amount of water on the surface. Now, of course, we're not starting this image with any preconceived notions. We're going to allow the ink to tell us what the image will become, but more on that in a moment. Now that we've got an ample amount of water on the surface, we'll dip our brush into the ink and just dip it back into the water. Allow the ink to flow on the surface and make interesting shapes. We can also manipulate the shapes using the brush a bit further, but again, we don't have a subject in mind yet. Okay, now it's time to start getting creative. We want to look at the values, the shapes, and the patterns that happen on the surface, and we want to start formulating an image. You might have to think about it for a few minutes. But then once an image starts to come to you, you can start manipulating the ink on the surface to create the image. In this case, I'm seeing a woodland scene, maybe a cabin, and maybe a bit of water in the scene. So first I'll start creating some distant trees and maybe a shoreline. Now at this point the ink is still wet on the surface, so I'm just basically moving it around with the Hake brush. Maybe this is the edge of the lake here, and I can pull a few strokes out to indicate some highlights in the water. And maybe we'll place the cabin right here. Again, everyone will see something different, and it's up to you to start pulling out your image. You're going to be developing the values and developing the shapes to create an image from the initial ink applications. Of course, many of these ink applications will get covered up, but that's okay. This is all about increasing your creativity and how you might see the different shapes and values on the surface. Maybe we'll add a couple trees here and a bit of plant life close to the shore here. And perhaps there are some distant trees off across the lake. I'm of course working very loosely here, still moving ink around with the Hake brush. I'm just allowing the image to happen. Here I'm just creating a few additional trees and maybe a little bit more variety here in front of the cabin. Remember, you're not working from any reference here. You're allowing the image to happen based on what the values and shapes tell you. So each layer of shapes and values that you apply are going to give you more ideas of what you can add to the scene. Here we can darken up the left side of the cabin to create somewhat of an indication of a light source. Okay, now I've switched over to a smaller round brush, and I'm going to start to develop a few of the details in the scene. Maybe there's a door in front of the cabin, and maybe we can darken up some of the shadows under the overhang of the building. Maybe there's some bushes and things behind the cabin. We can also darken up some of the values on the distant trees and add a bit more interest back there. Clearly, creativity is important for any artist, but you have to practice your creativity if you want to improve it. One of the best things about this exercise is it really only takes a few minutes, and you can repeat it over and over again. And each time you place the ink on the surface, you'll see something different. And the more that you do it, the better at it you'll become. And you'll notice that the approach that you take here can carry over into your more representational paintings and drawings. Now that our shoreline is starting to develop, I'm going to go ahead and add maybe a little small broken pier here. Again, I'm using the smaller round brush for this, and each application I apply, I'm using a little bit more ink and less water. Even then, the ink will dry a bit lighter, and you'll have to revisit areas to push the values darker. We'll add a few branches to this tree in the foreground, And of course, no tree wants to be by itself, so we'll add another tree right beside of it. Maybe we'll add a couple of windows to the cabin here. Clearly, an added benefit to this exercise is that it forces you to be a bit looser with your marks. There's something to be said about loose brush strokes on the surface. And if you have trouble developing that looseness, this exercise will help you develop that. It'll help you see that it's okay to have marks that are a little bit less controlled. In fact, it adds to the image and makes it a bit more interesting. We'll continue throughout the painting, just adding bits of detail as we see fit. And of course, since we're seeing this all from our imagination, we can add as little or as much as we like. Maybe we'll darken the shoreline here a little closer to the viewer. After all, objects that are closer to the viewer are typically a bit darker in value. And again, we'll revisit some of those bushes and things behind the cabin. In total, this exercise took a little under 15 minutes to complete. Devote yourself to improving your creativity at least once a week, or do several exercises like this in one day. You'll see the results carry over in your representational drawings and paintings. So grab some ink and see what you can create when you put your creativity to work.